Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Some say the Nazis' legendary strategy was a myth, others that it was a brilliant new way to wage war. Whatever the truth, the concept of striking quickly and setting their enemies off balance was key to how the German military approached warfare in the early 20th century. In the early stages of their quest for territory, the dive bomber played a key role in this strategy. But as the engines that powered their enemies' fighters got faster, and as the British fought back with ferocious tenacity, the dive bomber was nearing obsolescence. Something new would have to be found. A better way for the Luftwaffe to strike into enemy territory. They would need a Schnellbomber, a fast bomber. The 1937 Zurich Air Meeting. Pilots and aircraft from all over Europe arrive in the Swiss capital for 10 days of races, aerobatics and demonstrations. The Italians and the French both bring pilots and aircraft. The British send a small aerial team, and Germany has entries in many events. In an alpine circuit race that runs from Dubendorf to Thun to Bellinzona and back to Dubendorf, a Messerschmitt 109 wins the first round of the race. In the second section, a Dornier Do 17, a new German bomber, leads the way, completing the circuit in 58 minutes and 42 seconds at a speed of 233.5 miles per hour to win the race. Though the race is a minor event in comparison to the speed races and aerobatic displays taking place over the weekend, it is vindication for some members of Germany's fledgling Air Force. On board the plane during the race is General Erhard Milch, State Secretary for the Reich Air Ministry, a man who has played a key role in the aircraft's creation. It is an aircraft that has long been in the works. Its original concept began in 1932, when it was designed to be a freight aircraft for the State Railway or a fast mail plane for Lufthansa. But when the Nazis come to power, Hermann Göring plucks Erhard Milch from running Lufthansa and brings him into the Air Ministry. Milch gives the go-ahead for Dornier to build prototypes of the aircraft, and it is designated the Do 17. The resulting aircraft is less than Lufthansa hopes. Its cabin is cramped and it costs too much to use as a mail plane. Abandoned in a Dornier warehouse, it sits neglected until a Lufthansa flight captain asks to take it out for a ride. He takes the aircraft for a flight and discovers that not only is it very fast, but it's also a very nimble machine. With some work, it could become a fast bomber. Around this time, the Air Ministry set their sights firmly on their needs for the future, and they look for an aircraft that can be secretly converted into a bomber. They put out a call for a freight aircraft with special equipment. Some adjustments to the Do 17, mainly giving it a twin-tail stabilizer, may give them exactly what they need. The Swiss air race gives Milch a first-hand view of exactly how fast this aircraft is, and proof that it can compete with and even outrace modern fighter planes. Germany has found its Schnellbomber. The idea behind a Schnellbomber is simple. Create a medium bomber that can strike its targets quickly. Because of its fast speed, the Schnellbomber will not need any defensive armament. Its best defense will be to slip away before any pursuing enemy fighters have a chance to catch up to it.
To be called a Schnellbomber, in my opinion, is an aeroplane that could get in, drop its load accurately, and get out unscathed. That is a Schnellbomber. Low level. That's the key word.
From its arrival into the Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War, the Do-17 proves a capable aircraft. Then again in 1939, as Germany attacks Poland, it continues to prove reliable, serving as the backbone of the Luftwaffe's bomber force.
Well, the Do-17, the nickname was the flying pencil. A beautiful plane, yeah, was also the first one which I flew. That was during early 1940 in the multi-engine school at the Baltic Sea in Kolberg. Very nice, very smooth plane, still also with inline engines. They changed it later on to radial. And I think it was very successful in the Poland and French campaign. I flew over Berlin quite a bit with the Do-17s, and later on they improved it tremendously to the Dornier Do-17s, which was a radial. And Dornier Do-17s was used as a night bomber over England, I think, well into 1943-44. Both very nice planes, easy to fly, and specifically low altitude or no altitude at all, over the ground, exciting. Under the bridge and in height of tower, exciting plane, yes.
As the war progresses, however, the Do-17's fate begins to unravel. Its advantage of speed is diminishing with each passing day as British engines improve. By the Battle of Britain, Do-17s are being regularly shot down. In mid-1940, production ceases on the Do-17. It is to be replaced by two planes, a heavy bomber based on it, the Dornier Do 217, and an aircraft from Junkers, the Ju-88.
The early part, up to the mid-1944, the only Schnellbomber the Germans really had would have been the Junkers 88. Although they had Focke 190s and Messerschmitt 109s that could carry bombs, they were hardly Schnellbombers. They were more ground attack, used for ground attack. But as a bomber, the Junkers 88 was really the only one that could actually be nominated as that.
On its first flight in 1936, the Ju-88 races to a speed of 360 miles per hour, a full 100 miles an hour faster than the Do-17. Surely this will be the Luftwaffe's new Schnellbomber, one that will help them regain the advantage that has been lost in recent months against Allied fighters. At least it may have, if not for General Ernst Udet. The flying ace of the Great War is now in charge of the development wing of the Reich Air Ministry, thanks to his friendship with Hermann Göring. Udet's love of dive bombing leads to a major change in the Ju-88. Demanding that this aircraft become a dive bomber like the Stuka, it requires 2 years of re-engineering before the aircraft is ready to fly again in 1938. So enthusiastic are Udet, Göring and others about this new plane, they declare that it will be the standard bomber for the Luftwaffe, with factories all over the country set to churn out 250 units a month. Milch is less enthusiastic, but his worries fall on deaf ears, as the Junkers engineers impress Göring with tales of the bomber's amazing abilities. Now fitted with heavy air brakes and the increased weight giving it structural problems, the Ju-88 is ready to lumber into the skies. By the invasion of Poland, only 12 Ju-88s are available, and production continues to be slow while problems are ironed out. It is capable of diving on a target and dropping its bomb load with pinpoint accuracy, but at a price. The stress of pulling that much weight out of a dive takes a toll on the bomber's airframe. By 1943, tactics had changed to accommodate this, with the Ju-88 attacking at a 45-degree angle before releasing 4,400 pounds of bombs on its targets.
The Ju-88, in my opinion, was a first-class medium bomber. Of the three great airplanes I think the Germans produced in the war, I would say the Focke-Wulf 190, the Ju-88 and the Me-262 were the three. And the Ju-88 G4, for example, had a top speed of 400 miles an hour, which was 6 miles an hour faster than the 190A4 at that time, its contemporary fighter. So it was a formidable airplane. And also the Germans had learned from the mistakes of the previous medium bomber, the Heinkel 111, where you had the crew separated by the bomb bay. You had the flying crew up at the front and the defensive crew at the back. But there could be a breakdown in communication, which was not, and also there could be a breakdown in morale if you have the two separated. They had learned to put the four crew of the Ju-88 into one glass house, I think you would call it, on the fuselage. And the crews themselves were very enthusiastic about the airplane. I flew it quite a lot, that and the 188, and I was very impressed with both types of aircraft.
The shortcomings of the Ju-88 are becoming apparent, and while it maintains its place as one of the Luftwaffe's most reliable and versatile aircraft, something new is needed. The solution may be found in Bomber B, a call by the Air Ministry for a new medium bomber, one that will replace all medium bombers in the Luftwaffe. It isn't long before a Junkers design for that specification leads the pack, the Ju-288. This highly redesigned version of the 88 will have a new pressurized cockpit, the ability to fly at much higher altitudes, better speed in the form of two UMO 222 engines, and a bomb bay capable of holding twice the amount of bombs. While the design is approved by 1939, it isn't until late 1941 that the UMO 222 engines are available for testing, and they prove to still need quite a bit of work before being ready for production. Junkers has an idea to fix that problem, a stopgap design, improving the Ju-88 and turning it into the Ju-188.
And it was a very reliable, very nice plane. I liked the 88 and then the improved model of the 188, which I flew quite a bit too.
Well, the 188 had a rather different rudder effect, and I would say it had improved slightly, as one would expect with another move up the list. It had advanced a little over the Ju-88, but a negligible amount. It still had the good flying characteristics of the 88. In fact, slightly better.
Based on the Ju-88B, this aircraft will have a newly designed fuselage and nose and longer wings that come to a point. It is to be powered by the BMW 801 engine. All the extra power from that engine can carry a more significant bomb load, though that causes a problem. The bomb bay on the 88 is already too small to accommodate much more. External bomb racks can be added under the wings, but this will affect performance. Why hold the bombs externally? It is purely a matter of speed and simplicity. It is thought that in a quick strike, waiting for the bomb bay doors to open will waste precious time. Without a bomb bay, destroying the enemy will be as quick as releasing the weapons above the target. Also, Germany has yet to develop as sophisticated a bomb sight as the Americans had, with the Norden bomb sight. By flying in low and dropping the bombs based on sight, the Luftwaffe can be sure they're hitting the correct targets. Accuracy is important because the Luftwaffe's bombers are lacking in one very important department, their bomb load. The Allied heavy bombers can carry massive amounts of bombs. The B-17 holds up to 17,000 pounds of bombs. The Ju-88 carries less than half of that.
Well, I think we missed the high-powered engines. It was the material which the American and English airplanes, the engine of the airplanes, were much stronger, much higher horsepower, because they have the right proper alloys in order to build it. And so the power was missing in the German airplanes, in the Dornier and in the Heinkel. We never could carry more than maybe 2,500 pounds bombs, and whereas all the different bombers of the Ally could carry much more bombers.
The development of further Schnellbombers, and perhaps the very fate of the war, is changed by a decision right from the very top. In 1943, Adolf Hitler is planning ahead, thinking to the inevitable day when Allied forces will storm the beaches of France for an all-out assault on his European empire. One day, in the not-too-distant future, enemy soldiers, weaponry and tanks will be crawling from the surf onto the sandy shores, and he will need to be prepared for them. At this very time, Professor Willy Messerschmitt's team is creating what will become the world's first operational jet fighter, the Me-262. What had started as a bluff by Messerschmitt to prove to an Air Ministry official that he, like rival Ernst Heinkel, is interested in the emerging power of the jet engine, is now well on its way to becoming a reality. Messerschmitt's team is working on something very special. The engine power of this fighter is absolutely unrivaled by anything the Allies have, and it is hoped by many in the Luftwaffe that it will be the key to defending the fatherland from destruction. While test flights of prototypes started as early as 1941, the aircraft first flies with a traditional piston engine. It is only in 1942 that it truly becomes a jet aircraft, with the BMW 003 engine installed under each wing. But they continue to prove unreliable as tests push forward. The Junkers Ulmo 004 engine seems a likely candidate to power the world's first operational jet fighter. While enough tests have been undertaken by 1942 to determine the airframe is ready for production, progress is slow on creating enough jet engines to power the aircraft.
I rate the 262 as the most formidable aircraft of World War II. I wouldn't have welcomed flying against it with what we had as the opposition aircraft at the time, because, as I say, there was a big gap. Performance gap, huge performance gap of at least 100 miles an hour. This is a huge gap. When you have a gap like this, the Me-262 could dictate the conditions of combat, when to start the combat, when to finish the combat. It could just, it was in control.
By 1943, an even bigger problem comes up. Hitler has taken notice of this remarkable design, and although it is meant to be a fighter aircraft, he has a different idea about its potential in serving the Third Reich. He asks Willy Messerschmitt if the aircraft can be adapted or changed into a fighter bomber. Surely a plane this fast carrying bombs, even as small as 150 kilograms, can cause enormous amounts of chaos and destruction in those critical first hours as the Allies arrive on European soil.
Hitler's idea to convert the 262 to a Schnellbomber wasn't a bad idea, but technically it was a bad idea. But because Willy Messerschmitt actually said that it could be done, quite flippantly, the downside of Hitler insisting on the Schnellbomber was that the production of the Me-262 was stopped as a fighter, and he ordered that all 262s be converted to bombers. Now, the delay in that meant that the fighter units were then starved of this jet fighter. And Adolf Galland was absolutely incensed at this, and so were a lot of other high-ranking Luftwaffe pilots. But Hitler insisted that this aeroplane be converted to a bomber. And this had to a large extent, had a fairly large effect on the future of the fighter force.
It is a decision that not only delays the deployment of the Me-262, but drives a wedge between Hitler's command structure and some of the Luftwaffe's most important leaders. Captain Erich Braun of the Royal Navy interrogated Hermann Göring after the war.
The only one question he bridled a bit at was I asked him why he had fallen out with Galland at the end of the war. But he was obviously a bit fed up with General Galland, and who opposed his and indeed the Führer's use of the Me-262 as a bomber rather than a fighter. There's been a lot of talk about this because Galland, who was the General der Flieger, was very, very critical of the fact that Hitler used the 262 as a bomber over the beaches at Normandy. And it's interesting to hear Goering's view on this, because he was incredibly loyal to Hitler, and his view was it was a matter of priorities. And what was the major priority between the following? Either stemming the flood of the invasion at Normandy, or stemming the absolutely endless bombing of the Third Reich. And Galland believed in the latter, and Hitler believed in the former. And who's to say who was right? I think there's a case in both sides, frankly. But having said that, it's difficult to split a machine into two, so to speak. I think it would have been better to, with hindsight, I'd say it would have been better to have gone Galland's way.
The plans to adapt the Messerschmitt 262 to its new fighter-bomber role doesn't stop at simply adding bomb racks to its wings. Willy Messerschmitt has an array of tweaks and adjustments that he hopes to add to the design in order to give the Führer the best Schnellbomber available. The Me-262U2 is a development that swaps the nose of the aircraft for a glass one. This will allow a second crew member, a bombardier, to lie in a prone position within the nose and drop bombs on targets with much greater accuracy. As well, structures known as Viking ship mounts, due to their curvature, are placed on the underside of the 262s to hold bombs below the aircraft.
As a bomber, not outstanding, because it didn't have a good bomb aiming system. No, not outstanding. It would have been a big nuisance and could have created a lot of havoc, but I don't think it would have turned the tide.
The Luftwaffe's desperate struggle to maintain their dominance above the battlefield led them to create many wondrous fast bombers. The necessity of their situation had forced them to evolve the very basic foundations of the aircraft, giving birth to the jet engine. Though previous engines had left them underpowered in comparison to the bombers of their enemies, perhaps this technological leap forward can turn the tide back in their favor. With their enemies pushing in on all sides and resources becoming more and more scarce, the Luftwaffe turns to innovation to keep them in the game in the battle for Europe. Next time on the Fast Bomber. With Hitler supporting the development of the Messerschmitt 262 to bomb the Allied landing craft during the inevitable invasion, other manufacturers continue to put forth designs to take its place should it fail. From another jet-powered aircraft to some very unusual and unique designs, the Luftwaffe continue to look for the ultimate Schnellbomber.
The German Messerschmitt Me-262. Sleek, fast, and heavily armed, it was a quantum leap in fighter technology. For the Allies, The appearance of the new swept-wing fighter caused a great deal of anxiety and consternation. Nothing they had could come close to its awesome performance.
The top Allied fighter at the end of the war was the Spitfire Mark 14 with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. The Messerschmitt 262, which we captured and tested at Farnborough, had a top speed of 568 miles an hour. An advantage of almost 125 miles an hour, which means an aircraft with this performance, which is a quantum jump, can dictate terms of combat. It can initiate or finish combat as it wishes.
Considered by many to be the world's first jet fighter, it was in fact a distant second. Indeed, the first air-to-air kill credited to a jet fighter goes to the Gloucester Meteors of 616 Squadron RAF. On August 4, 1944, Flying Officer Dixie Dean, using the wingtip of his Meteor, toppled a V-1 flying bomb, sending it crashing into the ground. While the V-1 was a pilotless aircraft, it would still go down in history as the first jet versus jet encounter. It was a telling indictment. After a 21-month lead in jet fighter development, the Germans found themselves with just one design in production, the Me-262. By June 1944, only a handful were in service. But there was another jet fighter, one designed and built before the Me-262, the Heinkel He-280. Designed by Ernst Heinkel, it was capable of over 500 miles per hour. At this late stage of the war, the He-280 was nowhere to be seen. First flown in September of 1940, it was 2 years ahead of Willy Messerschmitt's Me-262. What happened? Was it simply indifference on the Luftwaffe's part, or was the promise of the He-280 sabotaged by political interference, incompetence, or bitter personal rivalries? To find the answers, we must first look at the state of military aircraft design and production, beginning in the 1930s. Since the end of the First World War, aircraft engine horsepower steadily increased. At the beginning of the 1930s, new engine designs and the promise of the supercharger led to more and more horsepower. The new all-metal monocoque airplane revolutionized aircraft design. The possibilities seemed limitless. Speed, altitude, and range records were smashed. Military commanders saw great promise in these new designs, and as Europe crept toward war, orders for new bombers and fighters began to rise. With little time or money left for the development of any new or questionable propulsion systems, work focused on the evolution of the piston engine. Many engine builders called the idea of a jet engine the thing, technically unfathomable and little more than a pipe dream. But there were those whose pipe dreams would become reality. In 1930, Flying Officer Frank Whittle, RAF, applied for a patent for his jet engine. This was followed by Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain and his secret jet engine patent in 1935. Robert Pohl, a colleague of Ohain at the University of Göttingen, was instrumental in bringing Ohain's invention to the attention of leading German aircraft manufacturer Ernst Heinkel.
This man, Pohl was his name, he wrote to Heinkel, whom he knew. And he said, I have a man here who is into something which I think has a tremendous future to it. He is into jet propulsion. It's a continuous combustion engine. It draws air in the intake, compresses it, and then the combustion cans are sprayed with gasoline, and it turns a turbine wheel to keep the thing running, and the exhaust comes out the half end of it. As long as you give it fuel, it'll run forever. And he says, I have a man here who wrote a thesis about this sort of application for a jet engine. It pleased me very much if you would meet him and see him and talk to him about his ideas and his applications for future aircraft.
With Heinkel's backing, the German inventor created a line of experimental centrifugal flow jet engines, similar to Whittle's, each with ever more thrust. The entire program was conducted as a private venture and in the utmost secrecy. The German Air Ministry was kept in the dark. On the other hand, Heinkel was also unaware that BMW was working on their own jet engine. BMW's design was an axial flow unit. More complicated than the centrifugal design, it offered more power and greater efficiencies. It was also being developed with the full knowledge of the German Air Ministry. In time, axial flow designs would power Germany's fledgling jet force.
Early in the days before, immediately before the war, the Germans had become aware of the practicality of a jet-propelled engine as being pioneered by Frank Whittle. And at first, they followed the same concept as Whittle of centrifugal flow, which is the simplest form of jet engine, really, and also probably the most reliable at that stage, certainly, in the pioneering efforts. But eventually, they turned quite rapidly after their first, if you like, experiments onto the axial flow type, which really offers many advantages. And they concentrated thereafter totally on axial flow engines. And within the limitations of the strategic materials they had, they were very successful in this. The only problem was that the axial flow engine is complex and therefore difficult to produce, time-consuming to produce. And also, unless you have the right strategic materials to contain the heat stresses, it can have a rather short productive life.
Work on a suitable test airframe for Heinkel's revolutionary new power plant was conducted at the same time. By August 1939, both engine and airframe were ready. Heinkel's HE-178 was no masterpiece. The short fuselage and stubby, elliptical wooden wings did not exude a sense of speed. On August 27th, test pilot Erich Varsitz settled himself into the cramped cockpit of the tiny aircraft. Watched by Ernst Heinkel and a small group of mechanics, the HE-178 began to roll. The takeoff run was short. Climbing to 500 meters, Varsitz circled the airfield once and came in for a perfect landing. Total flight time, 7 minutes. History had been made. Wasting no time, Heinkel telephoned Ernst Udet, the chief of aircraft procurement and supply at the RLM, the Reich's Air Ministry. The response Heinkel received was far from enthusiastic. The world's first jet would have to wait. On September 1st, Germany plunges Europe into war. Long before 1939, the name Heinkel had become a household name in Germany. Indeed, Ernst Heinkel's Flugzeugwerk had gained a worldwide reputation despite considerable restrictions placed on German aviation by the Versailles Treaty of 1919. During the 1920s and 30s, Heinkel produced a number of new military types for countries like Sweden and Japan. With the rise of Hitler in 1933 and the expansion of the new Luftwaffe, the opportunities for Heinkel seemed endless. Orders for fighters and bombers began to pour in. While many of Heinkel's designs, like the HE-111 bomber, were very good, they lacked what he desired the most: speed. Heinkel was passionate about high-speed flight.
Well, Heinkel, he loved aircraft that flew fast. He wasn't all that into aircraft that were fighters, propeller-driven fighters and escorts and that sort of stuff, like the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Messerschmitt Bf 109. He was a man consumed by speed. The faster an aircraft knew, man, I'm for that.
Even before the first flight of the HE-178, he created the HE-176, the world's first rocket plane, in 1939. Unfortunately for Heinkel, official reaction was muted, and with the onset of war, all work on the project ceased.
Udet, Göring, and all those other people in the early Reichs Luftfahrtministerium were propeller people. They believed airplanes that were driven by propellers and alternate engine systems They said, no. An airplane flies best with propellers. And so Heinkel was looked upon as some kind of a crackpot. And the research he was doing on jet engines, they felt was just silly and waste of money. And so he never got any real support from the Nazi government.
Shortly after Hitler came to power, a new requirement for an ultra-modern single-seat monoplane fighter was issued. Heinkel's response was the HE-112, powered by a 695-horsepower Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. Its direct competition was the Messerschmitt Bf-109 V1, also powered by the same Kestrel engine. The results were very close. While the Bf-109 was slightly faster, the HE-112 had a tighter turning circle and superior field performance. Amid general surprise and many raised eyebrows, Messerschmitt was awarded the new contract.
The Heinkel 112 was the better airplane as a combat airplane, and Rechlin test pilots endorsed that view entirely. So there was no doubt that from the pilot's point of view, Heinkel's 112 was number one.
For Heinkel, it was a bitter disappointment. It also marked the beginning of a new and rocky relationship between the aircraft manufacturer and the German Air Ministry. Undeterred, Heinkel continued with his quest for speed. Despite the lack of enthusiasm from Ernst Udet and later Erhard Milch, the State Secretary, Reich Air Ministry, Heinkel pressed on with his privately funded HE-280 twin-jet fighter. At the same time, the Messerschmitt Design Bureau completed a new twin-jet design study for the German Air Ministry. Submitted on June 7, 1939, the new proposal was accepted. On March 1, 1940, a contract for 3 airframes was awarded with the official designation ME-262. Simultaneously, and in the face of official apathy, Heinkel was rewarded with a similar contract. Even before the official contract had been signed, Heinkel had in fact cut metal on the first HE-280 prototype. The HE-280 was a quantum leap in aircraft design. Aside from the jet propulsion, the HE-280 was equipped with the world's first ejection seat and a tricycle landing gear. Prior to its first flight, a series of aerodynamic tests were conducted. Fitted with dummy engine nacelles, the prototype was towed into the air by an HE-111 and subjected to a number of gliding test runs. By March 30, 1941, the HE-280 V1 was ready for its first flight. With just enough fuel for takeoff, the HE-280 lifted into the air. After a single low-altitude, low-speed circuit, the HE-280 made a safe landing. It was the world's first jet fighter, but the world didn't take notice.
The Heinkel 280 was a state-of-the-art machine which no one really appreciated.
Just as the Germans were developing their jet technology, the Allies had their own secret jet programs as well. In England, Frank Whittle, like Ernst Heinkel, was battling against the same government indifference. The new jets were not a high priority. Frank's persistence, however, finally paid off. On February 3, 1940, the British Air Ministry issued Britain's first jet aircraft contract. Gloucester's aircraft was selected to meet specification E-2839. Design of this new aircraft was a collaboration between Frank Whittle and Gloucester Aircraft. The new E-2839 was a low-winged monoplane with the engine mounted behind the cockpit and equipped with a tricycle undercarriage, just like the HE-280. Air for the engine was drawn in from the nose and passed through ducts on each side of the cockpit. Like the Heinkel HE-178, the Gloucester E-2839 was one of the world's first technology demonstrator aircraft. Its sole purpose was to flight test Whittle's W1 centrifugal jet engine, which developed a modest 860 pounds of thrust. A remarkable aircraft by any standard, 2 examples were built. On May 15, 1941, the first E-2839 took off from Cranwell Airfield at 7:45 p.m. The flight lasted just 17 minutes. The promise of Whittle's engine pushed the Air Ministry towards an operational jet fighter. Even before the first E-2839 took shape, specification F-940 for a new jet fighter was finalized in December 1940. Because the new jet engine didn't have the required thrust, the new fighter would have to be a twin-engine design. The F-940 was not a radical or advanced aerodynamic design. Following accepted aircraft practices, it was fairly conventional. On February 7, 1941, Gloster's received an order for 12 Gloster Widow airplanes to the F-940 specification. These would become the first Gloster Meteors. Back in Germany, parallel work on the Me-262 was not proceeding smoothly. When the contract for the prototype had been issued, it was obvious to Messerschmitt that BMW had been unduly optimistic. The new BMW 003 axial flow engine was still unreliable, without sufficient power. It also had a substantially larger diameter. In order to accommodate the new larger engine, Messerschmitt had to completely redesign his original airframe. The new aircraft would be larger, with the engines housed in underwing nacelles, just like the HE-280. While BMW struggled with their jet engine, the Junkers Aircraft Company was working on their own turbojet, the Jumo 004. This would provide a backup in case the BMW 003 failed. On November 1940, the Jumo 004 was bench tested for the first time. Major problems were revealed, and just as the HE-280 V1 made its first flight, Messerschmitt's first Me-262 V1 was fitted with a nose-mounted Junkers Jumo piston engine. It was not the start Willy Messerschmitt was hoping for. On April 5, 1941, the HE-280 was officially unveiled. To impress his guests, Heinkel arranged for a demonstration between a Focke-Wulf FW-190A and the HE-280. During the mock combat, the HE-280 completed 4 tight circles before the FW-190 completed 3. Finally, Ernst Udet showed some enthusiasm. Top speed was 485 miles per hour, 77 more than the FW-190. Impressed, the German Air Ministry sanctioned the manufacture of 13 HE-280A pre-production aircraft. Unfortunately for Heinkel, mass production of the HE-280 was still out of reach. Heinkel now found himself up against personal rivalries, duplication, and incompetent leadership. To understand this state of affairs, we have to return to the beginning of the new Luftwaffe. After Hitler took power, he appointed Hermann Göring as leader of the new Luftwaffe. A World War I ace and squadron commander, Göring soon gave a number of his ex-squadron mates titles in the newly formed Luftwaffe. Ernst Udet was one of the first. Many had no experience in aircraft production, or had any business background. By 1941, German aircraft manufacturing was in a crisis. Under the command of Ernst Udet, aircraft production had stalled. For the first year and a half of war, Germany was only producing 800 aircraft a month. It wasn't until after the Battle of Britain and the setbacks in Russia did the German High Command take action. Unfortunately for Udet, he was unable to effect any real change. In November 1941, he committed suicide. Udet's successor was Erhard Milch. Milch was an able, ruthless administrator, but he lacked the military expertise necessary for the job. Although he had good understanding of aircraft production, he was unimaginative and a conservative when it came to research and development. July 18, 1942. The first Me-262 is ready for its first flight. Unlike the HE-280, the Me-262 is a tail dragger. Because of the nose's high angle, most of the jet's thrust is wasted. After a problematic takeoff run, it takes to the air for a short 17-minute flight.
When the Messerschmitt 262 was first tested, it was a tail dragger. It had a tail wheel. And the only way you could get the thing up at level was for the pilot to put on the brakes, and so the aircraft would come up level, and then they could take off with it.
Across the Atlantic, America finally enters the jet age with the first flight of the Bell P-59A. The date is October 1st, 1942. By the summer of 1942, the HE-280 was still very much in the picture. In June, the HE-280 V2 prototype was re-engined with two Jumo 004A engines, each rated at 1,852 pounds of thrust. Now, for the first time, both the HE-280 and the ME-262 are equipped with the same type of engine. Flight trials proved promising, with a top speed of 491 miles an hour being reached. A true comparison of the two fighters could now be made. Flight testing of the fourth ME-262 prototype showed that with the same power plants, it enjoyed a marked performance advantage over the HE-280. Compared to the straight-wing HE-280, the ME-262 looked faster. Its shark-like appearance and swept-back wings gave it a menacing presence. Even with this apparent advantage, the ME-262 still had a long way to go. For Heinkel and Messerschmitt, the road ahead was not a simple one. Both had suffered serious setbacks, their reputations now in question. In Messerschmitt's case, his new ME-210 twin-engine fighter was a complete failure. For Heinkel, the intractable problems associated with the disastrous HE-177 heavy bomber was a major distraction. By the summer of 1942, Germany was still victorious. After some unexpected setbacks in Russia, they were once again on the offensive. In North Africa, the First Battle of El Alamein began with Erwin Rommel leading the way. From a military perspective, Germany was at the height of its power, but it was now fighting on three fronts. Losses would be heavy. In September, the Battle of Stalingrad began with much promise. It was a bloody battle of attrition, and one in which Germans were losing. On November 1st, Allied troops break out of El Alamein. 7 days later, Operation Torch begins. Allied troops invade North Africa, with American and British troops landing in Morocco and Algeria. Rommel's fabled Africa Corps is now being squeezed on two sides. November 19th. Soviet forces launch Operation Uranus. Its aim: surround the city of Stalingrad and annihilate all German forces. The Soviet offensive is a spectacular success, and by the end of January 1943, the battle is all but over. The German Sixth Army surrenders. It was the first Nazi acknowledgement of failure. In May, the battle for Tunisia is over. German and Italian forces surrender, with 250,000 troops taken prisoner. These military losses represented a key turning point. Germany was now on the defensive. For the Luftwaffe, January 1st, 1943 represented a time of crisis. Its operational strength had sunk to some 4,000 aircraft. It had also failed to introduce new, more modern types, aircraft like the HE-280 and the ME-262. In fact, the Luftwaffe was drawing on its last accumulated reserves. Contingency plans were non-existent. Any new military setback would be catastrophic. The German High Command had resolutely declined the possibility of waging a defensive war. From Hitler on down, the mantra had always been attack. The losses in Stalingrad and North Africa put a severe strain on Luftwaffe resources. For the first time, serious cracks began to show. But it wasn't just the losses in North Africa and Stalingrad that hobbled the once mighty Luftwaffe. The pre-war belief that Germany's military conquests would be short led to short-term planning. New modern aircraft wouldn't be needed. It was a strategic miscalculation, and one that had a direct effect on the development of Heinkel's HE-280 and Messerschmitt's ME-262.
Heinkel was up against the German Air Ministry, even though he had Ernst Udet as his very good friend and confidant. The German Air Ministry, they wanted a flying machine propeller-driven like the Focke-Wulf 190, like the Messerschmitt Bf-109, that were designed for ground support, like in Poland and elsewhere.
For Heinkel, the battle for the HE-280 continued. As Germany's fortunes began to change, many still clung to the belief in a rapid victory, even in the second half of 1942. Erhard Milch was one of them. After Udet's suicide, he did manage to increase aircraft production, but at a cost. To avoid Hitler's wrath, Milch was unwilling to add any new types to the assembly lines. Doing so would cause monthly production numbers to fall. As a result, most of the pre-war designs remained in production right until the end of the war. Unfortunately for Heinkel and Messerschmitt, Milch's aversion to risk continued to have its effect in the one field where Germany could establish technical superiority: jet planes. In September 1942, both Erhard Milch and the German Air Ministry agreed. Any preparations for series production of the Me-262 would be premature, and in view of Heinkel's numerous commitments, production of the HE-280 was unrealistic as well. It was a curious point of view, but in early 1943, that all changed. In January 1943, Heinkel's HE-280 V6 prototype, powered by two Jumo 004 engines, took flight. For the first time, Heinkel pitched this version as a fighter bomber. In a complete about-face, the German Air Ministry changed its mind and began negotiations for the manufacture of 300 280s. It now seemed as if the 280 would finally see mass production and enter service before the Me-262. Ironically, the 262 V4 prototype, powered by the same Jumo 004 engines as Heinkel's new jet bomber, enjoyed a marked performance advantage over its rival. While the HE-280 was thought to be faster with a better rate of climb and ceiling, it only had 2/3 the range. In the end, the 262 was the superior fighter. In a letter dated March 27, 1943, Milch wrote to Heinkel, ending the 280 project. In Milch's letter, he claimed that the overall war situation today no longer allows us to run two designs side by side. For Heinkel, it was a bitter defeat. In a conference shortly after, Heinkel observed that Milch and his colleagues had a noticeable sense of unease about the jet, and the talk was always about jet bombers. For Willy Messerschmitt, victory over Heinkel would prove a Pyrrhic victory. Meanwhile in Britain, the Gloucester Meteor prototype DG-206 made its first flight. Like the Germans, British officialdom and industry were slow to deliver a reliable jet engine. Official confidence was shaken when the impellers on Whittle's W2B engine continually burst at high speed. This was eventually remedied with imported impellers from General Electric, who in 1941 built their own jet engines based on Whittle's design. Fortunately for the program, Rolls-Royce was called upon to take over development and production of the W2B engine. Back in Germany, development of the Me-262 continued. Compared to the British, the German program was disorganized, inefficient, and veiled in secrecy, even from those who should have known. Surprisingly, Adolf Galland, general of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was kept in the dark. Not until May 22, 1943, did he fly the fourth 262 prototype. Galland was so impressed that he recommended production of the Bf-109 be halted and changed to the new jet fighter. Galland's enthusiasm swept away any remaining hesitancy and vacillation. 72 hours later, Erhard Milch ordered the 262 into series production. But many questions remained. Why did those involved in the program not see the value of the 262 sooner and act before Galland's endorsement? Why was it kept secret from Galland? And why didn't he fly the HE-280? One can only speculate as to what might have been if just 2 years earlier he had flown the 280. Finally, Messerschmitt had what he wanted, but there was one man who didn't agree. Adolf Hitler rejected out of hand any mass production of the Me-262. Said Hitler, "Nothing will be done with the new jet until I have decided on its merits." Unfortunately for Messerschmitt, the Führer was increasingly obsessed with revenge and retribution. Striking back at the enemy was far more important than providing his fighter arm with a fighter capable of defending the Reich. This would lead directly to Germany's third jet-powered aircraft, the V-1 flying bomb. Powered by a pulse jet engine, the V-1 was the world's first cruise missile and the first jet-powered aircraft to see combat in World War II. Shortly after D-Day, the V-1 bombardment of London began. To help counter the threat, the RAF deployed the first jet fighter, the Meteor Mark I. Compared to the HE-280 and the Me-262, the Meteor was slower. But more importantly, it was a combat-ready machine powered by centrifugal jet engines. Though the German axial flow engine offered more punch, Frank Whittle, the genius behind Britain's early jet engines, was sold on the reliability of centrifugal design.
Now, axial flow engines are much more complex than centrifugal, but much more efficient. Ideally, one should have headed for axial flow. But one has to put oneself back a bit in time and remember where we stood in the history of jet development, and that was not very far along the road. Whittle, quite rightly, when I talked to him, he knew all about axial flow, but I said to him, "Why have you gone this way, Frank, into centrifugal?" And he said, "Because in this present state of the art, I am looking for reliability and simplicity."
In November 1943, Hitler saw the Me-262 for the first time. Hitler scolded those in attendance, asking why, after years of demanding a fast bomber, was he presented with a fighter? Hitler wanted to know if the jet aircraft could carry bombs. Messerschmitt answered in the affirmative. For Hitler, the matter was settled. The Me-262 would be produced as a Blitz bomber. In fact, Messerschmitt disobeyed Hitler and continued to develop his jet solely as a fighter. 6 months later, when Hitler found out, he flew into an incandescent rage. On May 25, 1944, he ordered all 262s to be built as bombers. It was a major blow and added more technical problems to an already troubled program. One of the biggest and ongoing hurdles was the development of the Jumo 004 engine into a reliable power plant. The Jumo 004 was an axial flow compressor design. In theory, it offered more power over the higher drag centrifugal compressor engines used by the British. In practice, however, the Jumo engines were considerably inferior. The shortage of strategic materials like chrome and nickel led to the failure of many substandard turbine blades at high temperatures. The Jumo 004 also suffered from decreased thrust at high altitude, fuel flow problems, and flameouts if the throttle was opened or closed too quickly. The Jumo 004 was a technical and operational failure. Not only did the Jumo 004 have a very short lifespan, it was unreliable, prone to surges, stalls, and fires. This was the Me-262's Achilles heel, one Allied pilots would feast on.
The engines were very sensitive. They were slow to accelerate to throttle movement, and you had to handle them very carefully to avoid flaming them out. Secondly, the designers hadn't thought of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. And this made life very difficult, for example, for landing. You need some drag if you're going to land, and since there was very little drag associated with the 262, you had to do a long, slow approach to landing. And this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAF Mustangs realized this, and the 262s they picked off was usually in that phase of the operation.
By July 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was fighting a losing battle. Unable to cope with the swarms of long-range American P-47s and P-51 Mustangs, it was quickly being destroyed. While the Me-262 was in production, the numbers in operational service were meager at best and would remain so until the end of the war. The first American B-17 shot down didn't occur until August 15th. For the Germans, the situation was desperate. Shut out since the rejection of the HE-280, Ernst Heinkel was finally brought back into the jet fold. Concerned with the slow production of the Me-262, the German High Command wanted a so-called rush job, a single-engine jet fighter that required little strategic materials to build. For Heinkel, it was a question of pride. Eager to prove himself once more, he accepted the challenge. Heinkel quickly realized that in order for the jet to work, the engine had to be mounted just above the fuselage, similar to the V-1. 12 days after the specification had been issued, the HE-162 mock-up was ready. On September 23, 1944, Heinkel's HE-162 was selected for mass production. Captain Eric Brown recalls demonstrating the HE-162 to Heinkel in a post-war test flight.
He was like a schoolboy jumping up and down with delight and asked very piercing questions about the handling of the aircraft. He had heard about the disaster we'd had with it. I found him with a very acute mind and struck me as a highly intelligent person.
By late 1944, the German High Command was fueled by fear, fantasy, and pathological denial. Galland said that the HE-162 was unrealistic. To mass-produce such a crude and untried aircraft and expect it to be flown by inexperienced Hitler youth was beyond reality. Even at this late stage of the war, Heinkel was working on at least 26 different versions. Using slave labor, 100 aircraft were produced in February of 1945. On February 6th, the first group converted to the new type. In the final weeks of the war, the so-called People's Fighter saw little action. Combat claims were made but never confirmed. Only one HE-162 was ever shot down by an Allied fighter. On May 5th, Germany surrendered. It was a crushing defeat. The new jet and rocket fighters introduced late in the war had no impact on the outcome. Many have argued that if the HE-280 had been produced sooner, history would have been different. Perhaps, but in the final analysis, the 280 wouldn't have made a dramatic difference. For Ernst Heinkel, there was a deep bitterness. His early groundbreaking developments were essentially ignored. As to who actually killed the world's first jet fighter, the answer is many. The HE-280 was quite simply a victim of mismanagement and industrial chaos. After 1936, Nazi management of the aviation industry was not centralized. Udet's technical office, Göring, the general staff, Milch, and all the aircraft designers jockeyed with one another for control of the aviation program. Instead of a uniform, consistent policy towards aircraft production, confusion and chaos reigned.
Göring must hugely accept blame for a lot of the failings of the Luftwaffe, particularly the delay and the mismanaging getting aircraft into production. And to a large extent, Udet was one of his causes of his problem. Udet was an extroverted, magnificent exhibition pilot in civil life, and he had been in Göring's squadron in World War I. Ernst Udet had no interest in politics, and Göring approached him as an old squadron mate and said, you know, the Nazi party needs you and your experience. Come in and be the head of our technical department. Udet was talked into this and was completely out of his depth.
Firms like Heinkel and Messerschmitt tried to build everything from trainers to strategic bombers. Every effort made by the Air Ministry to move them towards any specialization was effectively countered. Clear-cut technical objectives were never issued. Programs were allowed to continue regardless of the enormous waste in time, skill, and materials. Overall, the Nazi management of the aircraft industry was uncoordinated, inefficient, plagued by ignorance and incompetence. Even if the HE-280 had become operational in 1942, its overall effectiveness would have been limited. It all came down to the Jumo 004 power plant. Unreliable with a critically short lifespan, it was not ready for combat operations. Serviceability rates would have been low, as was the case with the Me-262. Finding good pilots would have been another issue. The number of newly trained pilots could barely keep pace with attrition. Fuel shortages also began to take hold. By 1943, the Luftwaffe was a dying force with no chance of recovery. As the world's first jet fighter, Heinkel's HE-280 was a marvel of technology and inspiration. Unfortunately for Heinkel, those in power saw little use for his twin-jet fighter. Hitler's reluctance to produce jets almost certainly doomed what little hope Germany had of ever producing an effective jet fighter force. As the Allies sifted through the spoils of their victory, the incredible technology left behind, they counted themselves lucky that Germany had recognized the potential of jet power too late.
The jets were left absolutely untouched. Now, I was puzzled about this, frankly. What had motivated this? It certainly wasn't because it was overrun too quickly for them to have got rid of these jet aircraft. I think, deep down, it was a sense of pride of what they had achieved in the technical field, and they wanted us to see it. I was quite astonished to know what it was because it had no propeller.
And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover." There was the awful race against time. There was the skullduggery.
She used to say, "Oh, well, Daddy's doing something very hush-hush."
I thought, my goodness, why didn't I think of this before? And it seemed so obvious then.
A small English church is the last resting place of a man who didn't just change the face of the earth. He enabled us to see what it actually looked like. His name was Frank Whittle. This is the story of how he invented the jet engine. He overcame all the odds, only to see the British government almost throw his idea away and miss a chance to shorten the Second World War.
I was born on June the 1st, 1907 in Coventry. My parents were working class. My father was a foreman in machine tool manufacturers. I lived there in Coventry for 9 years, went to an elementary school there. And then the family moved to Leamington Spa because my father bought a small, very small, engineering outfit called the Leamington Valve and Piston Ring Company. And I really did get my first engineering experiences there because I helped him sometimes for, I think it was about twopence an hour or something like that, making slots in valve stems.
In Leamington, Frank also won a scholarship to the town's secondary school.
I was very lazy with homework and got a series of raspberries for that. But at the end of term, I would often do quite well. For instance, I'd come top of maths, something like that. I never did win a prize at school. But I did an awful lot of private study. I used to go down to the library in Leamington Spa and study all sorts of things which are not in the school curriculum. And that was where I first started to learn about gas turbines. I was always attracted to flying from my earliest years almost. When I was 4, my favourite toy, and this was 1911, was a tin model of a Blériot. And my heroes were people like Captain Albert Ball and Major McCudden and so on, the VCs of the First World War, and I just wanted to fly. And also I thought that boys in the uniform of aircraft apprentices looked very good. So I decided I'd like to wear that uniform and applied to join as an apprentice.
The Royal Air Force, however, rejected young Whittle. He was too small.
I was sunk for the time being, but before I left the camp, a very kindly physical training sergeant, if you can imagine such a thing, took pity on me, and he gave me a diet to follow and a series of exercises, max holding exercises. I did all that for 6 months. I put on 3 inches on height and 3 inches on my chest. So I thought, well, I'll have another shot. And I wrote to the ministry, but they said, no, once you've been turned down, you've been turned down forever. So I thought, well, I'd go through the whole process again as though I'd never happened, in the hope that the bureaucracy wouldn't pick it up. And I was lucky that time and ended up at Cranwell in number 4 wing.
Whittle didn't enjoy life as an Air Force apprentice. In that rank, he would never get to fly. What brightened Whittle's life was the Model Aircraft Society, where he became the leading light at building working replicas.
So much so that the initials BWMAS, which stood for Boys Wing Model Aircraft Society, was, most people said that meant Boy Whittle's Model Aircraft Society, because we were known as Boy Whittle, Boy Smith and so forth in those days.
Whittle's skills at making model planes singled him out to the authorities. Perhaps he might be officer material.
There were to be 5 cadets selected from number 4 wing at Cranwell, and I was number 6 in the passing out list. So when the number 1 boy failed because of his eyesight, it made me eligible.
The founder of the Royal Air Force had his doubts, though.
Lord Trenchard nearly stopped it, because I hadn't been a leading boy and I hadn't made no kind of a name in sports, on which a lot of weight was put in those days.
Whittle's CO had a compelling reason to make Trenchard think again.
He thought that he'd got a mathematical genius.
It was this natural gift that got Whittle a cadetship. Less than 1% of apprentices made the huge step to join the elite in the Officers' Training College at Cranwell. Although this was next to the apprentices' wing, it was socially another world, one that shared the culture of the public schools from where most of the cadets then came. In the bleak Lincolnshire countryside, Frank Whittle's life now took a new direction. Cranwell provided a very intensive education for Whittle. For the cadets, just as it is today, the highlight of the course was the flying lessons.
I learned to fly on the Avro 504K. That was a very ancient type of aeroplane, 1911 type, and it sort with a toothpick between the wheels, you know, to prevent it tipping over on its nose, which in reality it helps it to tip it over on its nose, or even turn upside down.
Whittle was soon a daring, even overconfident pilot, and one who had his fair share of accidents.
I have to confess that I wrecked 2 or 3 aeroplanes. 3 at least, yes. The first one, I got lost and wanted to get back to Cranwell when the visibility had deteriorated very badly. It was the day, incidentally, of the cross-country run at Cranwell, which all cadets hated. And most of my fellow cadets thought I'd done it to get out of the cross-country run.
In between learning to fly and studying at Cranwell, Whittle first conceived the idea that would make him famous. It all started with a student thesis.
All cadets had to write a thesis, and I chose future developments in aircraft design, rather ambitious, and rather concentrated on the engine side. But the main thing in that thesis was that I arrived at what I now know was the well-known Breguet formula. I wasn't familiar with it at the time, connecting speed, range, engine efficiency and so forth. And to me, that meant that if you wanted to go very fast and far, you would have to go very high, heights of 50,000 feet, that sort of thing, at heights where the piston engine obviously wouldn't work, and at speeds which where the propeller wouldn't work. So I started to look for a new kind of power plant.
Whittle prepared this paper during the first half of 1928, but his findings at Cranwell were the fruit of the 5 years he had by now been training there.
My Cranwell thesis, when the professor marked it, he wrote on it, in effect, he didn't really understand it, but he gave me 30 out of 30, which I thought was quite satisfactory.
Whittle envisaged flying speeds of 500 miles an hour, at a time when propeller planes struggled to reach 150. These machines were noisy and shook the pilot terribly. That's because their engines were actually car motors on a bigger scale with many moving parts. Whittle felt an aesthetic dislike for such power plants.
The problem with the piston engine as you go up height, even though you supercharge it, is that the power drops off as the air gets thinner, and there eventually comes a point where it won't generate enough power to turn itself over against its own friction.
Whittle's idea would use the same principle as a balloon filled with air. When this escapes, every child knows what happens. But it wasn't clear how an engine might recreate such a force.
I considered a piston engine driving a fan inside a hollow fuselage, and then thought, well, why not throw that piston engine away, up the compression ratio of the fan, and substitute a turbine for the piston engine? And there was the turbojet.
By now, Whittle had left Cranwell, but his search for this solution had preoccupied him ever since.
It didn't come to me out of the blue, but for the simple reason that I've been trying to find it for 18 months. But just the thought, get rid of the piston engine and substitute a turbine, you might say that came out of the blue. Whether I was having a bath or whatever at the time, I couldn't tell you.
Whittle's plan proposed just one moving part. This would be a shaft with a compressor, driven by a turbine at the other end. It would work like this. The compressor spins round, sucking air into combustion chambers at many times atmospheric pressure. Here, this air is mixed with vaporized fuel and ignited. The hot gas created expands through the turbine, turning the shaft, and escapes into the atmosphere. It is this continuous force which propels a jet aeroplane along. The turbojet concept brought with it so many natural advantages.
A very big factor in favour of a jet engine was that when you went up high, the air temperature was very low, very cold, and that benefited the compressor a lot. It meant that you could get much better conditions for the compressor. And the other thing is that in a normal turbine, the velocity coming out of it is wasted. In the case of the jet engine, that was completely used. After the idea had come to me, I thought, oh, my goodness, why didn't I think of this before? And it seemed so obvious then.
This was Whittle's moment of genius. He had seen the future of powered flight, and he was a pilot officer, aged just 22.
I was at the Central Flying School at Wittering, doing the flying instructor's course. One of the instructors there was W.E.P. Johnson, who became a very good friend and colleague in later years, and he'd been trained as a patent agent. And he became very interested in my proposal. He thought it would work, and he helped me to draft a patent.
Have you ever patented anything?
No, I don't know a thing about it. Does a patent both publish and protect?
That is the whole point of patents. But one thing's essential. File a patent application before touting the thing round. Otherwise, you haven't a hope. I'll tell you what. Let's rough out a specification now.
Fine, what do we do?
Well, you make a rather better sketch, and I'll get on with the clever bit, the writing.
Okay.
Armed with his patent, Whittle offered his idea to industry. No one thought it could ever work.
According to the theories of the time, there was this fundamental difficulty with gas turbines, inefficient compressors, inefficient turbines, and the other big snag was the materials then existing in 1929 wouldn't stand temperatures of more than, say, about 500 degrees centigrade. But I knew, or felt pretty confident, that they would evolve in the normal course of development, and of course they did.
The positive young officer also went to London to put his revolutionary concept to the Air Ministry. Whittle fared no better when he met A. Griffith, one of the ministry's top scientists.
I went to see Dr. Griffith and another scientist at South Kensington, explain the idea. It was very coolly received. Griffith pointed out an error in my calculations, and it was all rather depressing, you know. And then after that, I got a letter from the Air Ministry saying, in effect, that they weren't really interested and so forth. It didn't help that I hadn't then received an engineering degree.
Soon after this rejection, Whittle seemed to have more bad news.
After I completed the flying instructor's course, I very nearly got posted to number 4 FTS, Abu Sweir in Egypt. That would have been a real nail in the coffin of the jet engine if that had happened.
Fortunately, the posting was changed. Whittle remained in Britain and served a year as a flying instructor. These were happy times for him. In May 1930, he married Dorothy Lee. During this period, he also got the chance to develop his exceptional flying skills. He was now one of the RAF's best pilots, and was chosen to fly in the Hendon Air Pageants, where he thrilled spectators with his skills at crazy flying. These were the red arrows of the day, and Whittle loved entertaining the public this way. At this time in Germany, a young scientist was eagerly looking forward to his first trip in an aeroplane. His name was Hans von Ohain.
I always dreamed about the beauty of flying. My first flight with a commercial airplane, I believe it was a 3-engine Yonkers, was a great disappointment. It was so noisy and so vibratory that I felt the piston engine and propeller is not the good propulsion system. The elegance of flying is destroyed by it.
The sight of smoke rushing from chimneys inspired von Ohain to think, if that force could be created by a turbine, maybe he could make a smoother aero engine.
High speed was not the primary goal. To me, the smoothness and low noise was more the starting point of my thinking. But as I thought about it, I noticed that, as a matter of fact, it will be capable of driving the airplane faster.
Britain's Air Ministry had declined to keep Whittle's patents a secret. Freely available, they quickly made their way to Germany, just as the Nazis came to power. These patents were widely read in German aviation circles, at the same time that Hitler was rapidly building a new Luftwaffe. Whittle's idea aroused no such interest in Great Britain, and his own jet engine remained stillborn. Yet the Royal Air Force was certainly keen to nurture its inventor.
After 4 years, every general duties officer had to specialize. He was given a choice between engineering, radio, navigation, physical training, and so on. But I didn't get a choice because, having been pestering the Air Ministry with inventions, they just said to me, "You will be an engineer." Though they'd stopped sending officers to Cambridge, they decided that I should go. So I went to Cambridge in September 1934 to take the mechanical sciences tripos.
Once at university, Whittle applied every piece of learning to his idea for jet propulsion.
I had got the feeling, rather, that I might be ahead of my time. With the extra knowledge I gained at Cambridge, I did become rather more aware of the difficulties.
Then this letter arrived in the post, which says, "My dear Whittle, this is just a hurried note to tell you that I have just met a man who is a bit of a big noise in an engineering concern, and to whom I mentioned your invention of an aeroplane sans propeller, as it were, and who is very interested. He's jotted a note at the top of the original letter. He says, "This letter changed the course of my life and triggered a revolution in aviation." And it did, because this letter rescued the turbojet idea in this country from oblivion.
The writer was Rolf Dudley Williams, an old friend from Cranwell. He visited Whittle at Cambridge with another former officer named Collingwood Tinling.
And they approached me with the idea of forming a company and getting on with it, and they succeeded.
A merchant bank was the catalyst.
Falcon Partners were approached by an intermediary, an engineer named Bramson. Williams and Tinling got in touch with him, and he got in touch with Falcon Partners, and Falcon Partners commissioned him to write a report on the whole project, which he did, and it was wholly favourable. Bramson's report, you might say, was another of the big key points in the whole story. He'd been very much involved with aviation. He was a pretty skillful aeronautical engineer. And his report inspired Falcon Partners to go on with the job. And in March 1936, they formed the company called Power Jets Limited.
Whittle told his backers the project had a 1 in 30 chance of success. The Air Ministry quickly added another obstacle.
One clause said that I was not to work more than 6 hours a week on the job. But of course, that didn't operate as an effective control on me. I worked practically full time.
At Cambridge, Whittle also had to fit in the task for which he'd gone to university in the first place.
And I very much wanted first-class honours, so I had to work like hell because I was designing the jet engine and preparing for my finals at the same time. And that was a very difficult thing to do. I succeeded in getting my first, happily, and then was able to turn back to the jet engine.
Whittle approached a manufacturer in Rugby to build the world's first jet engine. British Thomson Houston made steam turbines. Whittle drove over from Cambridge, rehearsing what he'd say to persuade the huge company to accept a contract. He succeeded, when all he could offer them was £2,000, well below what his project really needed.
The proper scientific way to go about the job would be to build a compressor and test it, build a turbine and test it, build combustion chambers and test it, and then put them all together when the results from each were satisfactory. But the cost for that would have been about £30,000, and there was no hope of getting that amount of money. So the only thing to do was go ahead with the complete engine. What we were doing was trying to prove the engine right from the word go.
In a cavernous Rugby workshop, Whittle set to work on this huge challenge.
The BTH built the engine, and I stood over it more or less while it was going on. I felt that we were going to be all right as far as the simple centrifugal compressor was concerned. I felt that the turbine was going to be all right, but I was uneasy about the combustion problem because we were aiming at 24 times the kind of combustion intensity that was obtainable in those days. But the engine became ready for running proper on April the 12th of 1937. A lot of people said it wouldn't even turn itself over. What did happen proved the very opposite. I gave a signal with my hands to raise the speed with the electric motor to 2,000 RPM, and that was done. And then I opened the main control, and it started all right. It accelerated out of control, and so did everyone standing around it. They all went down the factory like the wind. I didn't, because I was petrified with fright. I just couldn't move. And it seemed like perpetual motion, but of course it wasn't. The fact was that a pool of fuel had accumulated in the combustion chamber, which we didn't know about, and that was keeping it running after I'd switched off the control. Well, that sort of thing happened day after day. We had about 4 of that kind of runaway. Just after the engine first ran and we'd submitted a report to the Air Ministry, this was the subject of another report by Griffith, the man who turned the job down in the early days, and his report damned it with faint praise. He brought in all the difficulties, said that no propeller meant that we wouldn't have the slipstream to help us take off, and so forth.
Whittle didn't know that in Germany some people were by now far more willing to bet on his idea. One of them was Ernst Heinkel, a legend in his country's resurgent aviation industry. Von O'Hine had been introduced to him.
He was alone in his villa in Warnemünde. He explained to me that he wanted to finance the whole thing by himself if it works. And he said, I have the best aerodynamicists, I have the best and best designers, and I want you to tomorrow to speak with them and explain your ideas. I loved the Baltic Sea coast very much. I sure would think that would be a nice place to work, and so I choose Heinkel. Additionally, I felt I was afraid to go to engine companies. I thought they were too much ingrained in their recip engines, and my model didn't work sufficiently good.
Heinkel's company was attractive for another reason.
The whole development was very inexpensive, but when we would have asked for more money, we would have gotten it. So money was not a problem.
By contrast, the power jet's kitty was empty. As the Nazi threat grew, Whittle had a war winner, yet Britain was set to abandon it.
There were several things which hampered progress. In 1937-38, the worst was the tight financial situation. Our financial backers began to get cold feet. They had, quite unrealistically, expected that within a matter of a month or two, we would have an engine capable of flying in the stratosphere. Well, of course, we had breakdown after breakdown, and they began to lose heart. And they did not produce the money that they promised. The Air Ministry were very hesitant to help because we were in financial difficulty. After we'd first run the engine and shown that it at least was self-driving, they did agree to a very limited contract.
The ministry's grudging help only created new problems.
As soon as they gave us the contract, we came under the Official Secrets Act. That meant that we couldn't tell people what we wanted their money for. You can't go to someone and say, look, we've got a damn good idea, would you let us have some money? We can't tell you what it is, but it's very good. No, we couldn't do it.
By 1939, Britain had spent just £7,000 on Whittle's jet. His very position on the project was perilous. At the end of June, he was actually due to leave power jets. On his last day there, Whittle had to impress an important visitor with his engine.
On June the 30th of 1939, we managed to get a big breakthrough in the attitude of the Air Ministry, in that Pi, Director of Scientific Research, came up to see the engine run, and we managed to keep it going for about 20 minutes in his presence, and he became a complete convert. So much so that he agreed that an engine for flight should be ordered, and that an aeroplane to use it should be ordered too. When I drove him back to the station to catch his train back to London, I had the curious experience of him explain to me all the advantages of the engine, that it could run on any fuel, that it was vibrationless, etc., etc. And I just sat quietly. I was only a squadron leader at this time. I thought, yeah, you're telling me, old boy. This, of course, was the big turning point in the whole job.
The turbojet was saved for Great Britain, but Germany, unaware of Whittle's breakthrough, already had a jet plane.
I was very certain that it would work. But, of course, you always feel there's a danger. And we had made not too many pre-tests. We ran the engine before it flew perhaps several hours at the very most.
The support of a huge aircraft company had enabled Hans von Ohain to overtake Whittle. Heinkel's HE-178 was ready just days before war broke out. Test pilot Erich Varsitz was eager to take off.
He started and then he disappeared. And after a while he came back and we thought, oh, he's landing. He didn't. He made another round and we said, oh my God, he must like it. But we didn't have the airplane very filled up with gasoline. He landed and stopped the airplane just where Heinkel stood. And he said everything functioned beautiful and the engine worked well, and he was really himself, very enthused. We had a nice festival.
A jubilant Heinkel rang General Ernst Udet at the German Air Ministry.
I learned later on he called Udet and he said, hey, congratulations, but let me sleep. That's an ungodly time.
By now, Frank Whittle had been forced to move power jets from Rugby to a scruffy foundry at nearby Lutterworth. Ladywood Works was the name of the site. Today, there's nothing to show that history was once made here. But in these buildings, Britain slowly expanded its jet program.
In 1939, we only had just a handful of about half a dozen. And then at the beginning of 1940, we began to build up a team. And I was very careful in picking real quality. You know, first class honours Cambridge, first class honours Oxford, Imperial College of Science. We were advertising. Of course, we couldn't say what we were advertising for. And when we were interviewing them, we couldn't tell them what we wanted them for, although I think some of them guessed from the questions we asked.
Whittle's charm and enthusiasm at once inspired his new team to strive for the impossible. The noise and lack of space at Ladywood forced Whittle himself to work at Brownsover Hall, a country house nearby. Here he worked through the night, desperately aware that his work could shorten the war, and drove himself to nervous exhaustion.
My memory of him really was just somebody always working. And when he was at home, if he took any time off, say Sunday, he would sit in his chair by the fire at Broomfield, and we'd be there with his slide rule, which of course people used in those days to do their calculations, and bits of paper all over the place, working, and a little bit of time for myself and my brother, but not much, not much.
As Britain entered its most critical phase of the war, the expanding team at Ladywood was galvanised by a new order to prepare engines for a prototype jet fighter. Codenamed F-940, we know it as the Gloucester Meteor. As a potential war winner, getting it in the sky to fight the Luftwaffe now became the focus of their work at power jets. They did not know that Germany was by now developing its own twin-jet combat planes at Messerschmitt and Heinkel. The country's prototype jet, the HE-178, had not been a success, but its last flight was exploited to the full by its maker.
Heinkel invited the Air Ministry to come, and the highest who came was Udet, and somehow Heinkel used that possibility to offer a new design of a two-engine fighter aircraft. And actually, he got the contract about 2 months later.
The plane was the HE-280. The Nazis wanted it in 14 months. Heinkel passed this demanding deadline to von Ohain to build its jet engines.
Heinkel wanted things very fast. He was very optimistic, very positive, but a little bit unreal and unrealistic in his time schedules.
In Britain, the Air Ministry still wouldn't fund Frank Whittle properly, forcing power jets to work in impossible conditions.
In addition to our continuing financial problems, had many others, like having to use the same parts over and over again when they ought to have been scrapped. And of course that was linked with the finance, because we couldn't afford new parts. We had to make do and furbish up damaged parts.
Some people continued to claim Whittle's jet wouldn't even fly. By May 1941, his engine was ready to go in Britain's first jet plane, the experimental Gloucester E-28-39. For its maiden flight, the top-secret aircraft was taken to Cranwell, where the jet story had begun. The Power Jets team followed, full of hope. On the same day, a young naval pilot, Eric Brown, was forced to land at Cranwell. Today, he's one of the few surviving witnesses of this historic occasion.
When I landed, I was a bit astonished to find so many civilians present. And when I went to check in at the mess and asked what was going on, there seemed to be almost an air of conspiracy about the whole place. And nobody would give a straight answer to this.
We'd been out the day before for some taxiing trials. And then on the May the 15th, the weather looked as though it wasn't going to work out. So I went back to Lutterworth.
That morning I went to Control Tower to check if the weather was good enough for my en route flight to Croydon, but it obviously wasn't. And they said, would I mind doing a weather check for them? Anyway, I landed, and they said, would I be prepared to do a further weather test in the afternoon?
And then we got a message to say that the weather was clearing, so I rushed back to Cranwell again. And in the evening, Jerry Sayre did the flight.
An airplane was rolled out with a shape well, not so much the shape, but the construction of which I'd never seen before, because it had no propeller. And an extraordinary whining noise came from it, and it taxied out to the end of the runway, and after a while eventually took off. And I was quite astonished to know what it was, because I'd never heard at this stage in my career of a jet aircraft.
The various government ministries refused to film this remarkable event. Luckily, an unknown photographer grabbed it in secret.
Jerry Sayre was sitting at the end of the runway, a party of us was sitting just to the right, and he held it on the brakes and ran out the engine to full speed, released his brakes, and then he hopped off in about 600 yards. Quite an impressive takeoff. Then he held it down level and then glided. One of my colleagues, Pat Johnson, W.E.P. Johnson, slapped me on the back. He said, "Frank, it flies." And in the tension of the moment, I rather rudely said, "That was bloody well what it was designed to do, isn't it?"
And it landed successfully, and immediately it landed, it was absolutely inundated with people rushing out and congratulating the pilot. So I realized something quite extraordinary had taken place.
People in the area hadn't heard that particular kind of noise before, and you couldn't really hide it, however secret it was supposed to be. One officer was said to have asked another one, "How does that thing work, John?" And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover." Another story was that someone who claimed to have been an eyewitness said there was a Merlin engine inside the hollow fuselage with a little propeller. And he'd seen it. He was a reliable witness, he claimed.
Well, everybody gravitated towards the officers' mess. And so I followed on, and there was quite a lot of hilarity going on in a corner of the room. I asked what it was all about, but still nobody would reveal what was involved. But it was quite obvious. It was something quite momentous.
The flight vindicated Whittle. Britain's new jet plane was better than anybody had realised. One event particularly brought the point home.
The ministry gave us permission to open up to 17,000 just for one flight. And at that engine speed, it did 375 or 380. Anyway, it was faster than the Spitfire.
The news reached London and Winston Churchill. He ordered 1,000 Whittles. Alas, the E-28 could not be a warplane. Hence the disappointment felt behind the scenes up at Cranwell.
I would have preferred it to have been the Meteor, which was then on the stocks, because that was a combat aeroplane, whereas the E-28 was just an experimental aeroplane.
Whittle's jet served notice on all piston engines, a notice that fast reached their manufacturers. They now demanded their share of a product none had invented, and which they'd rejected for years. Because of the war, Whittle would have to share his secrets with them.
All this, of course, was putting power jets into a weaker and weaker position from the commercial point of view, and that we had to swallow because it was a wartime situation. And I and several other of my team were serving officers, and we had to put national considerations before commercial considerations. That was very dominant in my mind.
Whittle played a selfless, patriotic role, in which he offered his knowledge freely to the British aviation companies. However, they were working flat out to build engines for planes like the Hurricane and the Spitfire. So in 1941, Great Britain turned to the United States, then at peace, for backup in manufacturing its jet engine. The Americans had only been told about Whittle's power plant earlier that year. Ironically, their top scientists had dismissed the concept in 1940. They concluded the gas turbine engine could hardly be considered a feasible application to airplanes. The British government expected to keep the rights in Whittle's invention, and did not intend to give it away to a future competitor. But that's inevitably what happened.
We shipped over the engine in parts in the Bombay Liberator, also with the team, who were horribly frightened lest the pilot should pull the wrong lever and they'd all drop into the Atlantic.
The company selected to build the engine was General Electric.
For America, the jet story began the night of October 4th, 1941, with the arrival of a highly secret engine assembly at a Boston airport. It was Britain's now famous Whittle turbojet, the first jet engine successfully produced and flown by the Allies.
Gentlemen, I give you the Whittle engine. Consult all you wish and arrive at any decision you please, just as long as you accept a contract to build 15 of them.
General Electric had that engine, their engine, version of the W2B, called the Type I, on test in April of 42, so just rather less than 6 months, which was astonishing. And even better than that, 6 months later, the Bell Aircraft Company had their twin-engine jet flying. It was agreed that I would go over and help them out. And so I went over at the end of May. I went to Lynn under an assumed name. They insisted I use an assumed name. I called myself Whiteley. There were times when I forgot it, like in the hotel I would waking up, sign for my early morning coffee, and forget that I was supposed to be using an assumed name, and of course sign the real one. I'm told that that didn't matter really because the waiter was an FBI man.
In the Great Republic, Whittle was treated royally, and he in turn was astounded by what he found there.
It was most satisfying to see the work GE were doing because, well, they got on with the job so fast. It was remarkable. And their enthusiasm was most inspiring. And I thought at the time, if only I'd had that kind of cooperation a few years earlier, what a difference it would have made.
In America, doctors found that Whittle was by now battling with severe ill health. Back in Britain, the problems that caused it had only got worse.
The engine that was destined to be the power plant of the Meteor was a more powerful version of the experimental engine, really. There was no major difference. It looked quite similar from the outside.
The Royal Air Force eagerly awaited the Meteor, but Powerjets was not allowed to produce the engines for it. That job had been contracted to a car maker, Rover.
Gloucesters were getting on with the job fairly well, but Rovers were making an absolute nonsense of the engine. They just hadn't got the people who could do the job, and they thought they knew what to do. The situation became so bad that it looked as though there would be a complete hash of everything. The Rover were making such a poor job of the engine that the order for the production of the Meteor was cut right back.
Rover tried to redesign its engines and held up the Meteor by 2 years, but there was also dirty work.
We intended that the Rover company should be subcontractors, and only subcontractors, But unfortunately, they went behind our back to the ministry and tried to get direct contracts, and eventually they succeeded in doing that. And instead of being subcontractors to us, they in effect became competitors who had the advantage of having all our information handed to them on the orders of the ministry.
In December 1942, a solution was at last found to the problems with Rover. Rolls-Royce took over the job of building Whittle's engines. But the mighty company would only weaken power jets further.
Ernest Hayes was the chief executive of Rolls-Royce. He was responsible for the Rolls-Royce part in taking over the jet development. Of course, he had come to realize that this was the future of the aero engine. And since Rolls-Royce then were one of the most prominent aero engine firms in the world, he wasn't going to be left out. I would call him an honest rogue, because when he was going to do the dirt, he told you he was in advance. And one of the things he said to me on one occasion was, he said, "We're going to be the centre of this job, and nothing you can do will stop us." By 1943, the Rolls-Royce having made such a big difference to the prospects of the engine, the ministry agreed to reinstate the production of the Meteor.
With Whittle's engines, the plane finally made its first flight that year. Yet it should have been ready 2 years earlier. And had the Air Ministry pursued Whittle's idea back in 1929, a similar plane would have been available by the start of the war to repel the Luftwaffe. Lives would have been saved, the war even shortened. At least the work of Frank Whittle could now have a bearing on how that war was fought.
I thought that he was doing something quite important, because every time I asked my mother what he was doing, she used to say, "Oh, well, Daddy's doing something very hush-hush." I didn't become aware that he was anybody out of the ordinary until 1944 in January, when they made the whole thing public. And then the house became surrounded by reporters.
We had been working in complete secrecy until early January 1944, at which time, for reasons I don't really know, the British and American governments decided to make an announcement about it. It was like the world blew up around me. The shock was very considerable.
Whittle and his engine dominated the front pages.
Says here in the Daily Herald, "I knew Frank had a secret," says his wife. So the cat is out of the bag. How strange it seems to be able to talk about it. It may mean that I shall be known throughout the world. In any case, my younger son Ian is a far brighter boy than I was at his age. I think he will be a success, the success of the family.
Have you seen that?
No, I've never seen that before. Oh dear, how wrong.
As industry reaped the rewards of Whittle's genius, new jet fighters joined the Meteor. First off the drawing board was de Havilland's brilliant Vampire. The pilots loved their new equipment, although the planes remained highly secret, as Eric Brown discovered when he came to fly them.
When I was allotted to the jet flight at Farnborough, of course it was a top secret flight, and it was in a hangar at the far side of the airfield, well away from the main activity, and there were RAF regiment guards there with guard dogs, so it was very highly guarded at the time.
Once inside, the plane was a revelation to Brown.
We're getting into the cockpit of a jet airplane for the first time. You are struck by the wonderful view, because in a tricycle undercarriage, no propeller or large engine ahead of you. It is quite remarkable. And once you start up the engine, although to listen to a jet, if you're outside the cockpit, it sounds thunderous. When you're in the cockpit, it is incredibly quiet.
Frank Whittle often visited Farnborough to check how his invention was performing.
It was quite obvious he was itching to get his hands on it and fly it. But we were always alerted that he was coming, and a little memo would be passed round saying, would you make sure that the 2839 was not serviceable for flight on that particular day? And because this would stave off Frank, it was obvious they didn't want this wonderful airplane and this wonderful man to be united in case there was an accident. So he twigged this pretty soon, and I think he played along with it.
In July 1944, the Gloucester Meteor became the first jet fighter to enter operational service, when the Air Force allocated its initial supply of planes to 616 Squadron at Manston in Kent. By now, the Luftwaffe could no longer mount air raids over Britain, but these Meteors were quickly put to work, intercepting a lethal new menace, the V-1 guided missile. Germany's flying bomb terrified the Londoners who were its target. In the skies over Kent, the Meteor pilots sought to prevent V-1s reaching the capital. Some used their wingtips to flip the missile over, so it crashed. Around this time, Allied pilots were startled to find themselves being attacked by a German plane with no propeller. This was the Messerschmitt 262. Germany's own jet program had by now advanced to this sophisticated design. It had been chosen instead of the HE-280. The Nazis never liked Heinkel and had cancelled his promising jet fighter. Yet it could have been mass-produced by 1944. By contrast, the 262 arrived late and was rushed into battle too soon. In Britain, meanwhile, Frank Whittle seemed at his peak. He was a national hero, while his company now had a custom-built factory from which to expand. He had a clear vision for its future.
I always wanted to include manufacturing in our duties. In 1944, power jets had reached the point where they were able to produce, say, batches of 40 or 50 engines. And we had a first-class nucleus for proper manufacturing organisation.
Power jets also had some outstanding work in progress. Whittle was already planning the second generation of jet engines.
There was the LR1 turbofan, which would have been the first turbofan in the world. There was the engine for the Miles M52, the supersonic aeroplane. Those were our two big projects which we had in hand.
LR1 stood for Long Range 1. Whittle saw the scope for jets that would fly planes further as well as faster than pistons. But he would need a more efficient engine.
From the earliest days of the turbojet engine, I was bothered by the fact that it has a basically low propulsive efficiency, about 50% as compared with, say, a propeller at moderate speeds of 80%. And so the answer to me was that we must gear down the jet in some way. And that led to the concept of the turbofan, for which I took out a patent in 1936.
The turbofan is a turbojet to which a fan has been added. This fan causes air both to flow through the core of the engine and to bypass it. This additional jet of cold air increases thrust and improves fuel economy. The design had huge potential.
With a turbofan, you can expect propulsive efficiencies of 75% or even better if you have a very large bypass ratio.
As piston engine bombers approached their design limits with planes like the Lancaster, Whittle saw a timely use for his new bypass jet.
As the war progressed, in 1943, for example, I came to the conclusion that it could be the answer to a long-range bomber for the Pacific War. We also visualized it as an engine for a transatlantic aeroplane.
Whittle was already predicting long-range jet airliners and the kind of engines they would need. But it was the other power jet project that would grab people's attention.
The engine for the supersonic plane, the M52, was an aft fan with afterburning, all tacked onto the back end of a W2700 jet engine, and that should have given sufficient power for the Miles M52 to do 1,000 miles an hour. I think it would have done it.
Despite its huge potential, Whitehall never felt comfortable with power jets. It was a private company, but its driving force was a serving officer, and it was publicly funded. The fault lines were clear.
I realized that there was a complete mess from the contractual point of view. There were no effective agreements, and no one except power jets had risked any money, except the government, of course. And I felt that the government, having put in $2 million, that all the companies should be nationalised, forming a collective turbojet establishment, and of course I hoped that Powerjets would be at the top of the pyramid, with myself as chief engineer.
Whittle's proposal was considered in the high levels of government.
Sir Stafford Cripps, the Minister of Aircraft Production at that time, used what I'd said to get the ministry out of the mess that they created by nationalising Powerjets only, which relieved them of all their undertakings.
It was expected that Powerjets would still continue with its advanced engine projects.
But then other firms began to create difficulties. They said they weren't going to have the government competing with private enterprise. So considerable pressure was brought to bear on the ministry.
And the minister caved in to the large aero-engine companies.
So we, the people who had pioneered the whole thing, were deprived of the right to design and build engines. Sorry. That was too much for myself and my leading team members, and most of us resigned.
The supersonic plane and the turbofan project had by then been cancelled. The civil servants found a reason to justify this loss.
Believe it or not, the minister said that people wouldn't want to fly at speeds more than about 250 miles an hour.
As Whittle left Powerjets, he was acutely aware of the commercial opportunity that was now at stake.
The position in 1945 and 1950 was that Britain was really ahead of the world in all forms of gas turbine development, but stupidly we allowed the lead to slip away.
In 1945, the Allies discovered the Germans' impressive range of jet planes and their designers.
After the capitulation of Germany, I was at that time in Farnborough the CEO of the captured enemy aircraft flight. So I was sent to Germany and to look at their advanced aircraft, and also at the same time to interrogate their designers and test pilots. Amongst them was von Ohain, and naturally I wanted to know what his connection with the Whittle patent had been in Germany. But he was not going to answer this question. He was very non-committal and sidestepped it as much as he could.
Brown flew the various German jet planes, including the Messerschmitt 262. The Allies already knew that its engine, the Umo 004, was a sophisticated axial flow design. Now they could compare its performance with that of the less complex British jets.
So a more efficient engine in many ways. It was highly unreliable. The Umo 004 in operational service had a scrap life of only 25 hours. And the engine, when I flew this engine, I found it extremely sensitive and difficult to handle because it did not like quick throttle movements, either accelerating or decelerating. Any quick throttle movement either way could possibly cause a flame out of the engine.
Whittle's jets were more reliable, but he could take them no further. The course of events brought anguish.
I think my mother was most distressed by what was happening to father. She was most distressed. I could remember her crying about it at times, because she would tell me, "Oh, Daddy's so unwell because of what's happening, and it is such a shame, and how can they treat him like this?" Yes, it's very sad for her. He managed to soldier on in the RAF, and he was an Air Commodore in 1946, but in the end, by 1948, he'd been declared as unfit for flying, and somehow that was the last straw, and he and the RAF both agreed that he should retire, and he did.
It's been very sad for him.
Oh, very sad, yes. The Air Force was everything to him.
The public knew none of this and saw a war hero receiving his just rewards. In 1948, Whittle went to Buckingham Palace to collect a knighthood. He also had a financial award for his invention, which was good for the time. Worth nearly £3 million today, it would soon become clear he was greatly under-rewarded. He sought a role, but his stature made him hard to place in an industry he himself had founded. No engine maker hired his services.
In many ways, I paid quite heavily for the work I did. There was the awful race against time. That dominated life. On top of all the technical difficulties, there were the financial difficulties, there was the skullduggery of people who were messing things up, and it was frustration after frustration, and it took its toll. I began to have a series of nervous breakdowns, and for years, it was years before I really recovered my health.
Britain stole a march on the rest of the world when it launched the first jet airliner. The beautiful new plane, with its 4 engines, was a fruition of all Frank Whittle's early visions.
First, after he left the RAF, he turned his mind to the introduction of the Comet, and he joined BOAC as a consultant to help them introduce the Comet into service. He was very worried at the time that the thing was being rushed into service. I've got his 1949 diary where he discusses the strength of the square windows, and he was worried about that at the time, and was making a suggestion to de Havilland's on how they could get over the problem.
Whittle's advice was ignored. The Comet crashes which followed were caused in part by its square windows. With time on his hands, Whittle travelled and tried to recover his health. He also turned to writing his memoirs. The jet age took off without Frank Whittle, but the Royal Air Force was soon re-equipped with the benefits of his invention. By 1950, the Gloucester Meteor provided the backbone of Britain's air defence capability. It was a fitting outcome to all the secret toil of the Power Jets team in the dark days of the war. The nation did at last build its own supersonic fighter, in the shape of the English Electric Lightning, while jet engines also powered an awesome British fleet of nuclear bombers. But the country could never really afford such planes. They would later play an important role in the Falklands campaign, but were destined to become museum pieces. British civil jet planes fared little better. After the Comet crashes, it was Boeing 707 which brought long-range jet travel to the masses. By 1960, airlines were mostly buying their planes from America. That year, the bypass engine entered service. Turbofans soon followed. With their far better fuel economy, they were just what the airlines needed to realize low-cost global travel. For Frank Whittle, it was the ultimate vindication of his wartime vision, and revealed the sheer folly of cancelling his pioneer turbofan. Yet he never worked on jet engines again, and memories began to fade of how the story had begun.
I think in this country they were beginning to forget all about Frank Whittle by the 60s and 70s.
It was all so different in the United States.
They were so much more gung-ho. They were very good at slapping him on the back and telling him what a good chap he was.
In 1976, Whittle went to live in America.
I think he felt more recognised over in the States than he did over here.
After the war, Hans von Ohain had himself moved to America to work on jet propulsion for the US Air Force. Fascinated by each other's work, Whittle and von Ohain became good friends. Back across the Atlantic, Britain eventually rediscovered its genius of the jet.
By 1986, even the Queen took a hand and awarded him the Order of Merit. And other honours came along following that. So I would say from about the early 80s onwards, people began to remember who it was who was the prime pioneer of the turbojet.
And also a man with a profound legacy. Today, we make almost 1.5 billion air passenger journeys a year, cheaply and safely, thanks to Frank Whittle. He shrank the world, but his gift to Britain is less appreciated. Its famous plane makers have departed, but today Rolls-Royce is a world leader in building jet engines.
I'm often asked how I feel about it, and it's a question I find very difficult to answer. Things could have been a lot better. We could have had a much bigger influence in the war than happened. But when I see what's happened in the way of civil aviation and military aviation too, but particularly civil aviation, I can only say it's extremely satisfying, especially when you see something like the Concorde. And one of the things, you see, I never foresaw when I was working on this thing, is that I would be a passenger crossing the Atlantic in 3.5 hours. And incidentally, another thing I didn't foresee is that I would have a son who would be flying 747s as a captain in Cathay Pacific.
Kai Tak Aerodrome at Hong Kong had a very interesting approach, a curved right-hand turn right down to almost a touchdown. And when Father came with me in the back of in the cockpit in a Boeing 747, he was very startled when he saw that his son was flying an airplane at 1,000 feet straight towards the foothills and then making a steep final turn, which of course was quite normal at Kai Tak. It was the way you had to do it. I hadn't briefed him, unfortunately, so he was very white-knuckled by the time we landed. He was continuing to theorize in aerodynamic improvements and aero-engine improvements until the end of his life. He always took an active interest in Concorde and looking into a second-generation SST, supersonic transport, and making recommendations and speaking publicly and privately amongst the industry to try and encourage the airframe manufacturers to take the risk and embark on another generation of supersonic transports.
Concorde is a marvelous airplane. I've flown it many times, but I'm looking forward to the next generation of supersonic transports, which I think should be capable of carrying 300 passengers for distances of the order of 4,500 miles, like San Francisco, Tokyo, at speeds of about a Mach number of about 2.3. That's getting up to 2,000 miles an hour, as compared with the Concorde's 1350. But beyond that, I think we're going to see even much higher speeds than that in due course. Unfortunately, they're going to be very expensive propositions.
Sir Frank Whittle died in August 1996, assured of his position as the greatest aero engineer of the 20th century.